Another aspect you guys talk in the book to sort of go back to the thesis of the book that the Civil War is part of a larger global series of events. You say that Southern secession did not occur in a vacuum, and previous secessionist movements informed the American rebels' decision. Can you speak to that?
Well, that is beautiful. Thank you. No, it's a very interesting situation in that you have so many moments, right? This goes back to very much the nationalism. We have so many places where we have a colliding of identities. The United States just being one amongst many. And the Southerners very much looked, and other movements as well, they all looked to each other of like, how did you justify yourself? How did others justify them? Like, I read for my previous books the Hungarian Declaration of Independence in 1849. And it's the same structure as the American Independence Declaration of Independence. They knew what was going on. They knew this was a tool, a structure that gave them a sense and ability to legitimize their cause, right? If it worked in one place, it will work in ours, or it will justify what we are doing. And we need, that's always the key part. That's why we have the secession declarations in the US. That's why the Hungarians do it, why others do it eventually too. We need to outline why we're doing it, because that way the international community that will recognize us hopefully and assist us hopefully, which most times doesn't happen, knows why we're doing it, why we are in the right versus others being in the wrong. And the like, I mean, it's all about perception. Like this sort of goes full circle over and over. Is that these secession movements all believed that in some form or another they were wrong. Whether that is the Irish that say the British are allocating more money to the British Museum than to famine relief, or the Hungarians saying that the Austrians are trying to break us up by giving Banjalajic more power than he deserves to have, or Schleswig-Holstein saying, "Ooh, the Danish king is trying to break the duchies up," or Southerners saying Lincoln is trying to end slavery. It's perception, but that perception of an assault on your imagined community is then leading to a break, and it is it speaks to the incompleteness, I think, of the nation state development at this time, that there's such a major flux still during this period with regard to people wanting to separate. And in some cases it makes total sense, right? Like the Hungarians saying we don't want to be ruled by Austrians. In some cases it makes not a lot of sense, at least ethnicity wise. Like the Sicilians saying we don't want to be ruled by a Bourbon and Naples. In some cases it's very selfish, like in the case of Southerners wanting to own slaves. In some cases, like there's sympathy we can give, right? The Indian people wanting to break away from British rule.
Yeah, I think that's it. I mean, it comes, that is it though. That is really it. But it is very much, this ties on a broader point. This is an interconnected world. People know what's going on in each other's countries. People are very aware of what is happening. We mentioned earlier Lincoln's admirer of Kossuth goes to hear him speak when he visits the United States. People in Britain are watching the Civil War. Americans are aware of the Indian Mutiny or Indian War of Independence, whatever you want to call it. They're all very much aware of what's going on. They're paying attention, and they do actually, I don't necessarily copy each other, but to the extent that's what they do. Human beings are imitative. We imitate each other, and they do that. Of course, everybody has their own personal national slant on things, but it's very interesting the way they do follow what each other's up to, and make comparisons, favorable, unfavorable, based on what other people have done.
Yeah, lingering on that aspect, that, sort of the connectiveness of globalism. One of the biggest aspects of the Confederacy and the Civil War was that they were vying for international legitimacy, to legitimize their cause, to have foreign support militarily, politically. Um, what was sort of the international reaction to the American Civil War, especially when it comes to the European nations who were the targets of diplomatic efforts from both sides to recognize them?
You got the right to keep people on the podcast for this one. uh, you want to start with Britain and I take the continent, Duncan?
All right, sure. I mean, the trouble is, it varies. It varies from place to place. This is the problem. I mean, it's one thing. Of course, the air conditioning comes on now. Welcome to Southern California. No, it's the problem is that in a lot of ways they take from it what they want to take from it. I think that's an overriding issue. I mean, my first book was about the fact that, contrary to a myth that still exists, the British didn't split on political lines over the Civil War. You can find radicals supporting the South on the grounds they think the South has a right of independence, same as Hungarians, Poles, everybody else. And they say this out loud. On the other end, you've got conservative Britons, Duke of Argyll and company, who are absolutely opposed to the South. Either they're opposed to it because of slavery, they won't support slavery, or else they're opposed to it because Britain's an empire. It's got secessionist movements in the empire. Ireland is the most obvious example. So this is what people take away from it. They don't necessarily take away what people would think they do. But in a lot of ways, the South miscalculates very, very badly. They believe that Britain will enter the war in order to get cotton. And first of all, Britain's trade with the northern states is actually greater than with the South. And second of all, there's no actual need to go to war for cotton because Britain's got a glut of the stuff even before the war starts. So it's a strange kind of idea. The other reality is, in the 19th century, there's something of an equilibrium diplomatically, in that intervening in other states' affairs is generally frowned upon. It's because everybody is dealing with this new rising nationalism. There's a reluctance, a marked reluctance in the 19th century to interfere in other people's domestic issues. This is not the same as the late 18th century when France and Spain entered the War of Independence on America's side. You don't have those kinds of governments. You don't have that kind of diplomatic world anymore. It's very, very different. Go ahead, Niels.
Yeah, and I was going to say too that in some cases, like the Austrian Empire, right? They what happens in North America, it may just be what happens on the moon for them because it's of very little diplomatic importance. And actually, supporting the South would be counterproductive because if they support the South, how you say to Hungarians, like, "Oh, sorry, we supported the South, but you can't do that." And to stretch Duncan's point a little bit further, it also comes down to priorities, right? Northerners and Southerners are fighting each other. So what? In 4 years, in 5 years, in 6 years, this war is over. It's either a unified country again and we got cotton, or it's a separate country and we get cotton, or we can trade in North America. If it's separated, great. It's weaker. Maybe we have still to watch some more because now the South will be expansionistic or the North will be expansionistic. But in the great scheme right now, there's no point to intervene because, from British perspective too, they don't even seem to know what they're arguing about or fighting about, right? Like, and then, as I kind of make in other places as an argument, for a lot of Europeans, and especially the British Empire, what happens in North America is not as crucial as what happens with Russia. Very contemporary, if you think of it today, that there was a desire for the last decades to contain Russia, and it will continue for decades. That's why Britain expands into Afghanistan, because Britain is worried the Russians will come towards towards India, the crown jewel in Asia. The Russians will get a foothold in the Mediterranean and threaten the Eastern Mediterranean power for the British. So when it comes down to it, and make that case somewhere else, that when Britain has to, and these European powers have to evaluate adventure in North America, unpredictable, unclear reasons why, dubious morality if we side with the South, or a case of containing an autocratic expansionist empire in our own backyard, that takes priority for them.
I mean, it's also with Russia, for instance. Russia was broadly in favor of the Union because it saw it as a counterweight to Britain. Okay, and the fact is, I mean, people often present this purchase of Alaska by Seward as like this great feat of American diplomacy. What's often forgotten is what the Russians were looking at was it was more likely or not the British, in the guise of the Canadians, would seize Alaska. So in many ways, selling it to the United States was a better option for the Russians. So in some ways, and it was also an act of friendship towards the U.S. as well. So in some ways, the Russian selling of Alaska is very much grows out of these power politics. One, Russia wants to keep the U.S. sweet, and it's got this problem that it really can't defend Alaska in the final analysis. So it's a lot of this diplomatic stuff. It's less kind of the views are often just straightforward power politics, and that's how they operate. And the U.S. does this to a certain extent as well. I mean, it's just the reality. Diplomacy hasn't changed that much in some respects.
Yeah, it goes back to the opening quote of the book, the lust for power. But I do think it is an interesting point that Niels made about wanting to keep or not caring about the Civil War, because either way you're going to get trade, but even if they do split, now it's weaker and we're still sort of living in the age of imperialism. Um so then, it sort of becomes an easier target. Obviously, Britain is very involved in America up until this point.